Number 9. Endocannibalism. Endocannibalism is the practice of eating a deceased loved one's flesh after they pass away. Several different cultures have done it throughout history. In the past, this was how the once isolated Fore Tribe of Papua New Guinea showed respect for their dead relatives. Men consumed the flesh, while women and children ate the brains. At some point, however, women started coming down with a degenerative illness that was spread through molecules in the brains they were eating. The government outlawed the practice during the 1950s, and the disease rate dropped. The Wari people of Brazil also used to practice endocannibalism. They ate the flesh of both their enemies and their loved ones. Funerals lasted for days, and it wasn't until a corpse started to rot that the Wari cut it up and barbecued it. There was a certain technique to eating the dead. Touching the meat with bare hands or consuming it too eagerly was discouraged. The proper way to do it was to use a skewer to pick the meat up and delicately place it in one's mouth. Different body parts were reserved for different family members. For example, children and more distant relatives ate the deceased person's bones, while closer family members got the more preferable cuts of meat. The Wari no longer practice endocannibalism, and the tradition is becoming exceedingly rare throughout the world, as many cultures abandon flesh eating, but retain other, less gruesome elements of their funerary customs. Number 8. Ancient Egyptians sacrificed servants and redheads. Ancient Egypt's history of human sacrifice dates back 5,000 years. It didn't last very long, and seems to have died out by around 4,500 years ago, when the Great Pyramids were built. They weren't really into it, but during that short time, the Egyptians practiced a few different types of human sacrifice. Sometimes a pharaoh arranged to have their servants killed after they died so that their staff could join them in the afterlife. This was known as a retainer sacrifice, and it was only practiced from 3100 BC to 2900 BC during the First Dynasty. A pharaoh who wanted to carry out a retainer sacrifice would have had to be very powerful and persuasive. They'd have to convince their subjects that giving up their earthly life to continue working as a servant in the afterlife was somehow worthwhile. The pharaoh would also have to get the person's family on board with the idea, which was probably a tough sell. But it was doable. By depicting the pharaoh as a god, the Egyptian government had a basis to argue that the ruler would continue to have rightful ownership of his worldly possessions even after death. And there was no worthier or noble cause than to die with your god. Archaeological evidence of retainer sacrifices is scarce due to looting and other damage to graves. Egyptologists generally accept that the practice was real, but do not think that it was the norm. Rumor has it that the Egyptians also sacrificed redheads because they considered them to be bad luck. They believed that they could put an end to the bad luck by offering those with the rare hair color to the god Osiris. Number 7. Keeping loved ones close. When the indigenous Toraja people of South Sulawesi, Indonesia lose a family member, they do not give the person a funeral right away. In fact, weeks, months, or even years could pass before the deceased is properly laid to rest. This is because funerals are a big deal in Toraja culture. The higher a family's social class, the more expensive and elaborate their loved one's funeral is expected to be. These events go on for several days and are considered a way to give back to the community through gifts, money, and freshly sacrificed animal meat. And the standards are so high, it often takes some time for a family to come up with the money for it all. In the meantime, people keep their dead relatives inside their homes. They treat the corpse like the person is still living by feeding it, dressing it, talking to it, and even lighting cigarettes and putting them in the mouth. While awaiting their funerals, bodies are preserved with formaldehyde. Even when someone is finally given a proper funeral, it's not the last their family will ever see of them. Once a year, people remove their relatives from their tombs, clean their bodies, visit with them, and leave gifts for them. The Toraja people were mostly isolated from the outside world until the 19th century, when they came into contact with Europeans for the first time. Many converted to Christianity, but they also held onto their traditional beliefs and customs, including their funerary practices, which have been passed down for generations through word of mouth. Number 6. Moche masks. While we know quite a bit about the Aztecs and their ritual human sacrifice, the Moche were also a culture to be feared. From around 100 to 700 AD, the Moche culture lived in what is now northern Peru. The evidence they left behind tells the story of a farming society with a highly advanced culture. The Moche built sophisticated irrigation canals and created pottery and other items featuring detailed hunting, fishing, and fighting scenes, as well as human sacrifices. Sacrificial rituals were major events for the Moche elites, who played crucial roles in these ceremonies. Participants wore costumes, drank blood, and slayed sacrificial victims with a crescent-shaped knife called a tumi. Some experts believe that the victims were losers in fights against the elites, while others have suggested that they were prisoners of war. Maybe all of the above. The Moche may have tortured these poor souls for weeks leading up to their deaths, and they may also have eaten parts of their victims. When it came to burying their own, the Moche performed rituals that they believed would help the dead along their journey to the underworld. They often covered the faces of the deceased with masks that would be considered terrifying by modern standards. The coverings often featured cat-like teeth, large earrings, and other symbols that were meant to convey a person's social status. Sometimes, the masks were made to resemble Moche deities as a way of making it known that the individual was a high-ranking member of society. Number 5. Towers of Silence. By the 5th century BC, Zoroastrians living in Persia, or modern-day Iran, developed a distinct burial ritual called Excarnation. Also known as corpse exposure or sky burial, it involved exposing dead bodies to the elements to hasten their decay. This process took place in accordance with the Zoroastrian belief that human and animal corpses are unclean and could pollute the sacred elements of earth, water, and fire. The religion's views dictate that when a living being dies, their body becomes impure and is infiltrated by evil spirits. Sky burials were seen as a way to cleanse the dead of these spirits. Bodies were placed in rows on a circular raised structure called a dakma, or a tower of silence, where they were exposed to the sun and left out in the open for scavenging birds and wild dogs to feed on. In some cases, it can take just hours for animals to devour a body down to the bones. This fell in line with the Zoroastrians' desire to rid corpses of their flesh as quickly as possible. To most people, the idea of their loved one being eaten by wild animals is revolting and disrespectful. But some modern-day Zoroastrians still practice sky burials, particularly in India. As the country's vulture population teeters on the brink of extinction, subscribers of the faith have started using solar panels as a way to keep the 3,000-year-old tradition alive. The panels heat dead bodies to 230 degrees Fahrenheit to make them decompose faster. But because this technology is useless at night and during monsoon season, the sky burial custom is at risk of dying out. Number 4. Mound 72. The Mississippians were a Native American culture that once flourished throughout much of modern-day U.S. During the 9th century, they built a sprawling urban settlement in what is now Collinsville, Illinois. What's left of the site consists of around 80 large earthen mounds, although it was once much bigger. Known as Cahokia, it was the biggest city north of Mexico during its heyday. Archaeologists believe that the settlement's population peaked anywhere between 6,000 and 40,000 residents. One of the mounds at Cahokia, known simply as Mound 72, started out as a circle of 48 wooden posts called a Woodhenge. It was eventually replaced by the mound, which originally served as a tomb for 2 elite members of the ancient society. Archaeologists have discovered 5 mass graves at the site, with 20 to 50 bodies in each. They also found bodies buried above the mass graves. Altogether, they unearthed the remains of around 270 people who were laid to rest between the years 1000 and 1200. Several of the graves appeared to belong to elite individuals. Others appeared to have been sacrificed. Evidence shows that the victims were sacrificed in a series of episodes over time. In one instance, 52 malnourished women between the ages of 18 and 23 were killed. Another time, 39 men and women were clubbed to death. The victims may have been sacrificed in honor of the 2 high-ranking individuals who were buried in a separate grave within the mound, but it remains a mystery. Number 3. Child sacrifice. The Inca settled in a region of South America that is filled with volcanoes, home to violent earthquakes, and suffers from the dramatic effects of El Niño every 7 years. As I'm sure you know, these natural events can destroy homes, deplete food supplies, and even kill people. The ancient culture thought that their gods and goddesses controlled the weather and other things that they lacked an explanation for. To please the higher powers, the Inca offered cloth, food, coca leaves, animals, prayers, blood, and people. When things got especially bad, for instance when a natural disaster struck or when an emperor died, priests sacrificed prisoners of war or children who were purposely groomed to give their lives. The Incas believed that the victims would proceed to an afterlife that was much better than the conditions on Earth. In 1999, researchers discovered the frozen remains of 3 sacrificed children high in the Andes of Argentina. They were remarkably intact, despite having died 500 years ago, thanks to the frigid, high-altitude conditions where they were found. The oldest of the group was around 15 years old when the trio were sacrificed. She is now known as the Maiden of Llullaillaco. In the year leading up to the event, she lived under the guidance of priestesses, who fed her increasing amounts of alcohol and coca as her planned death date approached. The peasant girl also enjoyed foods like maize and meat, which weren't normally available to people from her social class. When it was time for the children to die, they were fed copious amounts of drugs and alcohol, perhaps to calm them down and make them more cooperative. They were then led almost to the top of the 22,110-foot volcán Llullaillaco, where they died peacefully in the freezing weather. Unlike many other Inca sacrifice victims, the children bore no signs of violence. They were simply left in a drug-induced stupor and may have even been unconscious. Number 2. Chinese coffin caves and hanging coffins. In the city of Anshun in southwestern China's Guizhou province, there are hundreds of thousands of coffins stacked inside caves atop a series of steep cliffs. The tradition of laying the dead to rest there dates back to ancient times and is rooted in the belief that it helps the souls of the deceased ascend to heaven. Local legend holds that the first people to live in Guizhou province moved there from China's central plains when they fled war many centuries ago. According to one story, they planned to eventually move back to where they came from, so they put the caskets in the caves with plans to relocate them. Another tale claims that the practice started as a way to keep the coffins dry in the flood-prone region. China is also home to another bizarre burial custom: hanging coffins on tall cliffs. The tradition's roots trace back to the ancient Bo and Guye people. No one knows what their reasons were for doing this. They may have had spiritual reasons similar to why people stack caskets in caves, because it gets the dead closer to heaven. Or they may have had practical motives, like keeping the coffins away from scavengers, or keeping the ground available for farming. The oldest hanging caskets date back an estimated 3,000 years, and how the Bo and Guye people got them into their high resting places is a mystery. Number 1. City of the Dead. Situated along the Ganges River, the city of Varanasi in northern India dates at least as far back as the 11th century. Some say it's been inhabited for over 5,000 years. Hindus have long considered it to be one of the world's holiest cities. According to Hindu scripture, a person can break the cycle of rebirth and attain salvation by dying and being cremated in Varanasi. Devotees also believe that bathing in the river washes their sins away. Many people come to Varanasi specifically to die. In fact, this is so common there is an entire housing market that caters to the men and women who move to the city for this purpose. Known as Kashivasis, these individuals pay to rent a room until they pass away. In some cases, they can stay however long they need, but some businesses have a time limit and will kick guests out if they are still alive after a certain number of days or weeks. The demand for funerals is so high in Varanasi that the city's cremation pyres burn bodies constantly, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and in plain sight. All the ashes are dumped straight into the Ganges River so that the dead can hopefully escape the cycle of reincarnation and move on to the next level of spiritual enlightenment. Throughout history, Hindu funerary rituals have been much more out in the open than those of the Western world, where death tends to be more of a hidden matter. But at the end of the day, while these traditions may seem strange to some people, they are just some of many ways that people from different cultures grieve, gain closure, and come to terms with their own deaths. Thanks for watching! What do you want to happen when you die? Let me know in the comments below, and remember to subscribe if you haven't already. We have lots more amazing discoveries coming up.